Welcome to the Undercover Insights channel. Today, I'm going to tell you about the story. A racist cop attacks a pregnant black woman in broad daylight, unaware her husband is a highly trained CIA operative. What happens next sends shockwaves through the town, exposing deep corruption and delivering a reckoning he never expected. This is a gripping tale of justice, resilience, and unshakable family bonds. The sun was blazing over the quiet streets of Edenvale, Mississippi, its golden rays illuminating the small suburban town. The day seemed perfect, with a gentle breeze rustling through the oak trees and children's laughter echoing faintly in the distance. Rachel Carter, a warm-hearted and accomplished black woman, stepped out of her modest yet elegant brick home. At 7 months pregnant, she carried herself with a grace that belied her condition. Her radiant smile and glowing skin reflected a deep inner peace, but that peace was about to be shattered. Rachel hummed softly to herself as she walked down the street, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. In her other hand, she held a small list of groceries for a special dinner. Her husband, Marcus, had been away on a business trip for weeks, and tonight she wanted to surprise him with his favorite meal. As she imagined his delighted reaction, her baby kicked gently, and Rachel chuckled. "I knew you'd like that," she whispered, rubbing her belly affectionately. Her neighbors waved as she passed, their smiles matching hers. Rachel loved these walks. It was her moment to enjoy the fresh air, feel the rhythm of the town, and connect with the community. But as she approached a quiet corner, lost in thoughts of the evening ahead, a sharp screech of tires disrupted the tranquility. A police car, its siren momentarily silenced, veered abruptly to the curb beside her. The sudden noise startled Rachel, and she froze as the passenger side window rolled down. Behind it was Officer Travis Bennett, a white policeman with a cold demeanor and an unsettling reputation for targeting black residents. His piercing gaze locked onto Rachel like a predator sizing up its prey. "Stop right there!" Bennett barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Rachel's smile faded, replaced by confusion and a growing sense of unease. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Bennett didn't bother to answer. Instead, he stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the pavement as he approached. His towering frame and aggressive body language made Rachel instinctively place her hand on her belly. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, his voice dripping with authority. Rachel hesitated, her heart pounding. "I'm just going to the store," she said, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "Why do you need to see my ID?" "Because I said so," Bennett snapped, closing the distance between them. "You're acting suspicious, wandering around like this. I need to know what you're doing out here." The accusation struck Rachel like a blow. She had done nothing wrong, just a peaceful walk to the store. But the way Bennett looked at her with disdain and barely concealed hostility made her feel as though she was already guilty of some unspoken crime. Her pulse quickened, but she steadied her breath, reminding herself to stay calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm heading to the store to pick up a few things, that's all." "Just show me your ID," Bennett's voice thundered, cutting her off. His sudden aggression drew the attention of bystanders, who began to gather at a safe distance. Some pulled out their phones, recording the tense interaction. Rachel fumbled in her purse, her hands trembling as she retrieved her ID and handed it to Bennett. He snatched it from her, glancing at it briefly before shoving it back into her hand. "What are you really doing out here?" he sneered, his tone accusatory. Rachel's confusion turned to frustration. "I told you," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'm just going to the store. Can I go now?" Bennett's face twisted in anger as he stepped closer, towering over her. "You think you can talk back to me?" he hissed. "You're hiding something. I can see it." Rachel raised her hand slightly, palms outward, in a gesture of submission. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, I just want to—" "Stop resisting!" Bennett shouted suddenly, his voice echoing across the street. The onlookers gasped, their murmurs growing louder as the officer's behavior escalated. Before Rachel could process what was happening, Bennett lunged forward and shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, her feet unsteady as she tried to keep her balance. "Please, stop!" she cried, her hands instinctively shielding her belly. But Bennett wasn't done. His face contorted with rage as he raised his voice even louder, accusing her of resisting arrest. Without warning, he lunged again, this time kicking her squarely in the stomach. The force of the blow sent Rachel crashing to the pavement. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through her, and she clutched her belly, tears streaming down her face. "My baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, my baby." The street fell into stunned silence, the gravity of what had just occurred sinking in. Then chaos erupted. Bystanders rushed to Rachel's aid, shouting at Bennett and calling for an ambulance. "She's pregnant!" someone yelled. "Call 911 now!" Rachel lay on the ground, her body racked with pain and fear. As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Bennett stepped back, his face a mask of indifference. "Everyone back off!" he shouted, trying to maintain control. But it was too late. The tide had turned. Phones captured every moment, and the town of Edenvale would soon know the truth about Officer Bennett. But for Rachel, the damage was already done, and her life and the life of her unborn child hung in the balance. The peaceful streets of Edenvale, Mississippi, erupted into chaos as the horrific scene unfolded. Rachel Carter lay crumpled on the ground, clutching her swollen belly, her cries of pain piercing the stunned silence. Officer Travis Bennett stood a few feet away, his face expressionless, as though unaware of the monstrosity he had just committed. Around them, a growing crowd of bystanders stood frozen, their shock giving way to outrage. "Someone call an ambulance!" a voice shouted, breaking the silence. The urgency spread like wildfire as onlookers fumbled with their phones, some calling emergency services while others recorded the scene. Rachel's vision blurred as waves of pain coursed through her body. She whispered desperately to herself, her hands trembling as they cradled her unborn child. "Please, my baby, please be okay," she repeated, her voice breaking with each word. Bennett, however, tried to regain control of the situation, his voice booming over the murmurs of the crowd. "Everyone back off! I'm handling this." But the crowd was no longer listening. Their focus was on Rachel, her agony, her vulnerability, and the monstrous act they had just witnessed. A woman knelt beside Rachel, her face pale with concern. "Stay with me," she said, gently holding Rachel's hand. "Help is on the way." Another man stepped forward, glaring at Bennett. "What kind of monster kicks a pregnant woman?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. Bennett's composure cracked. "Step back," he barked, his tone more defensive than authoritative. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon, but he hesitated, realizing the tide of public sentiment was rapidly turning against him. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Moments later, paramedics rushed to Rachel's side, their movements quick but careful. "She's pregnant," one of them said, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to move her carefully." The crowd parted to give the paramedics space, but their anger toward Bennett only grew. Whispers turned into shouts as people voiced their disbelief and disgust. "He's supposed to protect us, not attack us," one man yelled. "This isn't law enforcement, it's abuse." Rachel was carefully placed onto a stretcher, her face pale and etched with pain. As the paramedics wheeled her toward the ambulance, she reached out, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, my baby." The ambulance doors closed, and the sirens wailed as it sped away, leaving behind a street heavy with tension. All eyes turned to Bennett. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by a defensive posture and a pale, ashen face. He tried to assert his authority, but the crowd's fury drowned him out. "You think we're just going to let this slide?" a man shouted, stepping forward. "We saw what you did. Everyone here saw it." "Yeah, and so will the world," another voice chimed in, holding up a phone. "This is going online. People are going to know who you really are." Bennett's breathing quickened as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The faces around him were no longer those of compliant citizens. They were witnesses, judges, and soon his executioners in the court of public opinion. By midday, Edenvale was a town transformed. Videos of the incident flooded social media, igniting a firestorm of outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForRachel and #End Police Brutality trended nationwide, drawing attention from media outlets and civil rights organizations. The footage was unambiguous. Officer Bennett's actions were not just unprofessional, they were inhumane. The once quiet streets of Edenvale became a hub of protest. Crowds gathered outside the police station, their voices a unified roar demanding justice. "We will not be silenced," a local activist shouted into a megaphone. "Rachel Carter deserves justice, and we won't stop until she gets it." Inside the police station, Bennett's world was unraveling. His superiors summoned him for questioning, their faces grim as they reviewed the damning evidence. The chief of police, a stern woman with a reputation for integrity, slammed a tablet onto the table, the video of Bennett's assault playing on its screen. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice cold as ice. Bennett stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a pitiful attempt to justify his actions. "She was resisting," he muttered. "She was acting suspicious." "Stop," the chief interrupted, her glare cutting through his excuses. "That woman was unarmed, pregnant, and posed no threat. What you did was an abuse of power and a disgrace to this department." As the interrogation continued, the protests outside grew louder, their chants echoing through the station's walls. "Justice for Rachel! Accountability now!" Meanwhile, at the hospital, Rachel lay in a sterile room, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment. Her husband Marcus had arrived, his face a mask of worry and fury. He held her hand, his voice soft but resolute. "We'll get through this," he promised, "and he'll pay for what he's done." Rachel nodded weakly, her strength sapped, but her spirit unbroken. As she rested, the firestorm outside continued to grow, and the world waited for justice to be served. The town of Edenvale was ablaze with fury. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForRachel and #End Racism Now, fueled by the horrifying video of Officer Travis Bennett kicking a pregnant Rachel Carter to the ground. Outrage spread like wildfire, with people from all corners of the country demanding justice for the defenseless woman who was simply on her way to the store. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Hospital, the atmosphere was suffocating with tension. Rachel had been rushed into the emergency room, her cries of pain echoing down the sterile hallways. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced urgency, their faces grim as they assessed the damage. Her trauma had caused a placental abruption, a life-threatening condition that endangered both Rachel and her unborn child. Rachel clung to the nurse's hand, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "save my baby." The nurse squeezed her hand gently, her voice steady and reassuring. "We're going to do everything we can. You just need to stay strong for your little one." As Rachel was wheeled into surgery, the hospital doors burst open, and Maria Daniels, Rachel's best friend, stormed in. Her face was flushed with worry and rage. "Where is she?" Maria demanded, her voice trembling. A nurse pointed her to the waiting room, where Maria collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. Minutes later, Maria was allowed to see Rachel briefly before the surgery. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed to her friend's side. "Rachel!" she cried, gripping her hand tightly. "Oh my God, what happened?" Rachel's voice was faint, her strength fading. "Maria, I'm scared. My baby." "You're not alone, Rachel," Maria said firmly, brushing tears from her own cheeks. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You're the strongest person I know, and you're going to get through this." As the doctors wheeled Rachel away, Maria sat in the waiting area, silently praying for her friend and her unborn child. She didn't have to wait long before her phone buzzed. It was David Carter, Rachel's husband. David was in the middle of a high-stakes business meeting when the call came through. Seeing Maria's name on his screen, he stepped out, his heart pounding. "Maria, what's wrong?" Her voice was frantic, her words coming out in a rush. "David, it's Rachel. She's in the hospital. That cop, he attacked her. She's in surgery. You need to get here now." David froze, the air leaving his lungs. "What did you just say?" Maria's voice cracked. "He hurt her, David. She's fighting for her life and the baby's." David didn't wait for the details. He left the meeting without a word, his mind racing. But David Carter wasn't just any man. Behind his polished image as a businessman was a former CIA operative, a man trained to stay calm under the most extreme pressure. Yet this was different. This wasn't an enemy across borders. This was his family. The flight back to Edenvale felt like an eternity. David replayed Maria's words over and over in his mind. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior. Someone had dared to harm his wife, and they would face the full force of his wrath. When David arrived at the hospital, Maria met him in the hallway. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's in surgery. They're trying to save the baby." David's legs nearly gave out, but he steadied himself. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice cold and low. Maria hesitated before answering. "It was a cop. Officer Travis Bennett. He just attacked her for no reason." David's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "Where is he?" Maria shook her head. "I don't know, but the whole town knows what he did. People are furious." David sat down, his hands trembling as he buried his face in them. The man who could outsmart dangerous criminals and dismantle threats was now feeling powerless. But not for long. Deep in his heart, David knew one thing: whoever hurt Rachel would pay, and he would ensure it personally. Hours later, a doctor approached the waiting room, his face grave but calm. "Mr. Carter?" David leapt to his feet. "How is she? How's the baby?" The doctor's voice softened. "We managed to stabilize Rachel and deliver your son. He's very small and will need to stay in the NICU, but he's alive. Your wife is a fighter." Relief and fury warred within David. He thanked the doctor, but as he entered Rachel's room and saw her fragile form, a new resolve hardened in his chest. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "David," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady. "You and the baby are going to be okay, I promise." But deep inside, David's mind was already racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Travis Bennett would face justice, and David would use every skill he had to make sure of it. David Williams sat in the dimly lit hospital room, his hand gently clasping Rachel's as she rested. The pale light from the window cast long shadows on the walls, mirroring the storm brewing within him. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper as she asked, "Is everything okay?" David forced a gentle smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Everything's going to be fine," he said softly. But deep inside, a fire burned. This wasn't fine. What had happened to Rachel and their unborn son wasn't just an attack. It was an assault on everything David believed in, and it demanded justice. The next morning, David stormed into the Edenvale Police Department. His calm, composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a man determined to hold Officer Travis Bennett accountable. "I need to speak with someone in charge," he demanded at the front desk. After what felt like an eternity, he was ushered into a small conference room with two senior officers. Their body language was defensive from the start. David wasted no time. "My wife was attacked by one of your officers. I have witnesses, videos, and a hospital report. What's being done about this?" One officer, a graying man with a smug expression, leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Williams, we're aware of the incident and it's under review. Officer Bennett claims your wife was resisting and he acted within his rights." David's fists clenched, his voice tightening. "Resisting? My wife was 6 months pregnant, walking to the store. The entire town has seen the footage. Are you seriously trying to protect him?" The second officer, younger but equally dismissive, shrugged. "There's no clear evidence of misconduct. Sometimes situations get complicated." David's jaw tightened as he fought to keep his composure. "Complicated? A man kicks a pregnant woman to the ground, and you call that complicated?" The graying officer raised a hand. "Mr. Williams, this isn't the place for emotional outbursts. The investigation will take time." David stood, his voice cold and deliberate. "Time is a luxury you don't have. The world is watching, and so am I." He left the station, his mind racing. It was clear the system would protect Bennett, no matter the evidence. David had dealt with corrupt systems before, but this time it was personal. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed. Messages flooded in, links to the viral videos, articles about the incident, and support from strangers across the country. The world was demanding justice, but David knew social outrage alone wouldn't be enough. At home, David sat in his office, the room cloaked in shadow. His demeanor shifted, the kind husband giving way to the meticulous strategist. David wasn't just a businessman, he was a former CIA operative, trained to dismantle the most impenetrable systems. And now he would use those skills to protect his family. He began making calls, his voice low and deliberate. Each conversation was precise, coded, and filled with cryptic instructions. To anyone listening, it might have sounded like a foreign language, but to David's contacts, it was the beginning of a coordinated operation. Every word, every call was calculated. As the last call ended, David leaned back in his chair, his mind already mapping out the next steps. He had spent years in the shadows, gathering intelligence and dismantling threats. Now he would turn those same skills on Bennett and the system protecting him. No stone would be left unturned. The next day, rumors began to swirl around Bennett. Anonymous tips flooded the department, exposing his history of excessive force and misconduct. His superiors, who had been so quick to dismiss David, now found themselves under scrutiny as well. The pressure was mounting, and David wasn't done yet. Late that night, as Rachel slept, David sat by her side. Her breathing was steady, her face calm, but the sight only fueled his determination. He gently placed a hand on her belly, a silent promise to their unborn son. No one would ever harm his family again. In the quiet darkness, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a single message lighting up the room. Phase 1 complete. Ready for next steps. David's expression hardened. He typed a brief reply. Proceed. Justice wasn't coming. It was already here, and David was its architect. Officer Travis Bennett woke to the shrill sound of his alarm, his head pounding from a restless night. The bright Arkansas sun filtered through the blinds, but the light brought no comfort. He rubbed his eyes, feeling groggy and disoriented, as if he had woken into a nightmare he couldn't escape. His gut told him something was wrong, but he brushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to the stress from the recent public outcry. As he stepped outside to retrieve his morning paper, he froze. Several small envelopes and packages were scattered across his porch. Frowning, Bennett bent down, gathering them up, assuming they were misplaced mail. But when he tore open the first envelope, his stomach dropped. Inside were printouts detailing his darkest secrets, incidents of abuse, buried complaints, and confidential reports that should have been erased from existence. His hands shook as he flipped through them, each page exposing something he had thought was long forgotten. The final document hit harder than the rest. Photographs of him taken from angles and locations that proved he'd been followed. Someone had been watching his every move. At the bottom of the last page was a single message in bold, menacing letters. "We know everything." Bennett staggered backward, his breath shallow. He scanned the quiet suburban street, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but it was eerily normal. The morning felt suffocatingly still. Slamming the door behind him, he locked every bolt, his paranoia clawing at him. For the first time in his life, the man who wielded power as a weapon felt powerless. The day unraveled further. When Bennett tried to start his car, the engine refused to turn over. He opened the hood, only to find wires cut with surgical precision. His phone, once a lifeline, became a source of frustration, glitching, restarting, and disconnecting seemingly at random. At work, his colleagues avoided him like the plague. Conversations halted when he entered the room, and his usual nods of acknowledgement were met with whispers and side glances. Desperate for answers, Bennett approached his superior, Captain Roberts, whose cold demeanor was a far cry from the usual camaraderie. "Captain, I need to know what's going on," Bennett said, his voice tinged with desperation. Roberts didn't look up from his paperwork. "You've made a mess, Travis. I suggest you clean it up before it gets worse." "What mess?" Bennett snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I was just doing my job." Roberts finally met his eyes, his tone icy. "This isn't just about your job anymore. The entire department is under fire because of you. Fix it or you'll be on your own." Bennett left the office seething, but beneath the anger was a gnawing fear. The walls were closing in, and he had no idea how to stop it. By evening, Bennett sat in his darkened living room, surrounded by the damning documents and photographs. His mind raced, searching for answers. Who could have done this? How did they know so much? His chest tightened as he realized that whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were dismantling him piece by piece. His phone buzzed, breaking the oppressive silence. He hesitated before picking it up. The sender was unknown, and the message was chillingly simple. "Watch this." Attached was a video link. With trembling fingers, Bennett clicked it. The screen filled with footage of his living room, from angles he hadn't noticed before. The video panned around, showing every corner, every hidden nook. It was as if the walls themselves had eyes. The camera finally stopped on a note placed on his coffee table. Heart pounding, Bennett looked at the table in front of him. The note was there, just as it was in the video. He grabbed it, his hand shaking so violently he could barely read the words. "You crossed the line. Make it right, or the world will know everything." Bennett felt the walls of his home closing in. Someone had been inside, bypassing his locks and security systems. They had left without a trace, but their presence lingered like a specter. Panic surged through him. For the first time, Bennett truly understood what it meant to be hunted. Meanwhile, David sat in his dimly lit office, his phone glowing faintly as he watched the live feed from Bennett's house. The carefully orchestrated chaos was playing out exactly as planned. Every move Bennett made was under David's watchful eye, every reaction meticulously calculated. David's phone buzzed with a new message. "Phase 2 complete. Awaiting your instructions." He typed a quick reply. Stand by. He's unraveling. Let him feel it." He leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smile on his lips. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The system had failed his wife, but David wouldn't. As the night deepened, Bennett paced his living room, his mind a whirlwind of fear and paranoia. Every sound, every shadow became a potential threat. He knew he was out of his depth. He wasn't dealing with an angry civilian. He was dealing with someone who knew how to strike fear into the heart of a man who had spent his life wielding power over others. Somewhere in the darkness, David was watching, waiting. The reckoning had only just begun. Officer Travis Bennett's usually commanding demeanor was gone. As he stood in the dim light of his living room, his hands trembled as he held the note that had shattered any remaining confidence. The words, bold and haunting, glared back at him. "You messed with the wrong family. Make things right, or the world will know everything you've done." Bennett's world had spiraled into chaos, and he now understood that his tormentor wasn't some impulsive agitator. This was someone methodical, someone dangerous, someone who knew exactly how to dismantle him piece by piece. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Whoever they were, they had bypassed every layer of his supposed security, leaving no trace but an undeniable message. They were in control, and he was not. He considered calling the police, but then the absurdity of it hit him. What would I even say? Someone's outsmarting me. Someone knows my darkest secrets. He knew he'd only look more guilty. Worse, if he alerted his department, it could escalate his already precarious position within the force. The unease was suffocating, the walls of his once secure home now feeling like a prison. The next morning, the town of Harrison was buzzing. News of Officer Bennett's upcoming press conference had spread like wildfire. The videos of his assault on Jane had gone viral, sparking nationwide outrage. Activists, reporters, and curious locals gathered outside the police station, their faces reflecting a mix of anger, curiosity, and determination. Placards with phrases like "Justice for Jane" and "Stop Police Brutality" filled the crowd. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Inside the police station, Bennett sat alone, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror. His face was pale, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness. He adjusted his tie with trembling hands, trying to compose himself. But he couldn't shake the image of that note or the countless anonymous messages he'd received since. His tormentor had stripped him of his power, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. Finally, the moment arrived. Bennett stepped out onto the podium. The flash of cameras was blinding, the murmurs of the crowd deafening. He hesitated for a moment, his usual air of authority replaced by a palpable nervousness. He gripped the edges of the podium to steady himself, taking a shaky breath before speaking. I want to address the incident that occurred a few days ago," he began, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. "What I did was wrong. I overstepped my authority, and my actions were unacceptable." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the defiant officer they had expected. Bennett's hands trembled as he continued, his tone increasingly desperate. "I want to apologize to Jane Williams and her family. I deeply regret the pain I caused. There is no excuse for my behavior." The crowd murmured in disbelief. This sudden admission of guilt was the last thing they'd anticipated. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, their cameras capturing every quiver in his voice. Bennett swallowed hard, his gaze darting nervously across the sea of faces. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I am resigning from the police force." The silence was deafening for a moment, followed by a wave of stunned whispers and murmurs. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in the chaotic aftermath. But Bennett didn't wait to answer. He stepped away from the podium, his shoulders slumped in defeat. and disappeared back into the building. From a distance, David Williams stood among the crowd, his arms crossed as he watched the spectacle unfold. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, scanning Bennett's every move. He could see the fear etched on the man's face, the realization that his life was crumbling. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. Back at the hospital, Jane was recovering, her strength slowly returning. She watched the press conference on a small TV in her room, tears streaming down her face as she heard Bennett's apology. It wasn't justice, not fully, but it was a step toward accountability. Beside her, Maria held her hand, whispering words of encouragement. When David returned to Jane's room later that evening, he found her staring at the screen, her expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "Did you see it?" she asked softly, her voice fragile. David nodded, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "I saw it," he said calmly, "but it's not over yet." "What do you mean?" Jane asked, her brow furrowed. David's gaze hardened, his tone steady but resolute. "Bennett's resignation is just the beginning. There's a system behind him that allowed this to happen, and that system needs to be held accountable too." Jane squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his. "Just don't lose yourself in this," she whispered. David smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I won't," he promised, "but I won't let this happen to anyone else either." As night fell over Harrison, the town buzzed with conversations about the press conference. But for David, it wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the opening chapter of a much larger reckoning. David's calm exterior masked the storm brewing within him. As the echoes of the press conference died down and the crowd dispersed, he held Jane's hand tightly. The public apology and resignation from Officer Travis Bennett felt like a victory, but David knew it was just the beginning. Injustice didn't end with one man's career. It ran deeper, embedded in a system that had enabled such abuse of power. As they returned home, Jane's expression was a mixture of relief and confusion. She sat on the couch, looking at David with questioning eyes. "Why did he just give up like that?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I thought they would protect him like they always do." David's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes steady and reassuring. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people need to face the consequences of their actions. That's when they realize they can't run forever." He gently placed his hand over hers, but Jane's curiosity lingered. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "David," she began cautiously, "I've always trusted you, but I've also always known there's more to your job than you've told me. The travel, the strange calls, the way you seem so calm under pressure. What are you not telling me?" For a brief moment, David's expression flickered, an almost imperceptible crack in his composure. Then he smiled again, a quiet sadness behind his eyes. "Jane, my job has always been to keep you safe. That's all that matters." He squeezed her hand, and though his words were meant to comfort her, they left her with more questions than answers. Later that evening, as Jane rested in their bedroom, David retreated to his dimly lit office. The soft hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the silence in the room. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A message from one of his contacts read, "It's done. Higher authorities have the reports. He won't escape accountability." David's jaw tightened as he typed a simple response. "Thank you." But he didn't set the phone down. Instead, he opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out a small, unassuming metal box. The lid creaked slightly as he lifted it, revealing an array of items that spoke to a life Jane had never known. A CIA badge glinted under the desk lamp, alongside encrypted devices, passports with multiple aliases, and photographs from past missions. These weren't the trappings of a businessman. They were the tools of someone trained to operate in the shadows, to uncover secrets, and to dismantle threats with precision. David stared at the badge for a moment, his reflection distorted in its polished surface. He hadn't opened this box in years, but tonight felt different. His family had been attacked, and that made this personal. Whatever lines he had drawn in the past to separate his two lives had been erased the moment Travis Bennett hurt Jane. He closed the box, locking it away, and turned his attention to a framed photo of Jane on his desk. She was smiling, radiant and carefree, on a sunny day long before their lives had become entwined with this nightmare. He reached out, gently tracing the edge of the frame with his fingers. "You deserve peace," he murmured, "and I'll make sure you have it no matter what." The next morning, Jane awoke to find David sitting beside her, his hand resting protectively on her belly. She stirred slightly, opening her eyes to meet his. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his voice calm and steady. "Everything's fine. No one will ever hurt our family again." Jane smiled weakly, comforted by his words, and drifted back to sleep. But as David left the room, his mind was already working. This wasn't just about ensuring Jane's safety. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Meanwhile, Officer Bennett's life was unraveling. Though his resignation had been public, the details of his fall from grace were far more complex. Anonymous reports and damning evidence had been sent to law enforcement oversight committees, painting a vivid picture of his long history of misconduct. Complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from his record resurfaced, accompanied by video evidence and witness testimonies. Bennett's colleagues began distancing themselves, whispering behind his back and avoiding eye contact. His once pristine reputation had crumbled, and he was left to grapple with the realization that he had become a pariah. Every attempt to clear his name only seemed to deepen the hole he was in as more evidence surfaced with each passing day. But David wasn't done yet. That evening, as David sat in his office, he received a call from one of his contacts. "It's time," the voice on the other end said. "We've gathered everything we need. The system won't protect him anymore." David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Make sure it reaches the right people," he replied. "This isn't just about him. It's about setting a precedent." As the call ended, David allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The wheels of justice were turning, and while they were far from perfect, he had ensured they would not stop this time. The following week, news broke that Bennett was under federal investigation. Charges ranged from abuse of power to falsifying reports and violating civil rights. The nation watched as the former officer's name became synonymous with the very corruption he had once represented. For the first time in years, Harrison felt a shift, a sense that change might be possible. For David and Jane, it was a bittersweet victory. As they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the town, Jane turned to David. "Do you think this will really change anything?" she asked softly. David looked out at the horizon, his eyes steady. "It's a start," he said, "and sometimes that's all we need to keep moving forward." Jane nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. In that moment, she felt a sense of hope, fragile but real. And as the light faded, the two of them sat in silence, united by the trials they had endured and the unbreakable bond that had carried them through. The story is a powerful reminder that justice requires courage, vigilance, and collective action. It teaches us to stand up against racism, abuse of power, and injustice, no matter how daunting the challenge. True power lies not in domination, but in serving and protecting others. We must hold those in authority accountable, ensuring they act with integrity and fairness. The story also highlights the importance of resilience, as seen in Jane's strength and David's unwavering determination. In today's world, we must challenge discrimination and support those who fight for equality, reminding everyone that change begins with courage and unity. Subscribe Undercover Insights channel for more meaningful and inspiring stories.